Dr. V.M. Xavier, President of the TMA, Mr. Paul Thomas, Vice President, Mr. Vinod Manchila, Senior Vice President, Mr. Pratap Varki, Mr. Francis George. Please excuse me if I've missed out anybody. I'm not as familiar with you as I would like to be. And most of all, my good friend, Mr. Ajit Kumar, who I hope is in the audience. Thank you for giving me this chance to speak to you, and thank you for inviting me to address you at this important meeting. I was delighted to learn about Thrissur itself, the industrial base that was introduced, the number of business people, but what really touched my heart was the number of educational institutions that were listed. It is students who are the future of India, and I am delighted to know that there are so many educational institutions in Thrissur, and I'm sure all those students benefit greatly from interaction with you. Today, I hope to speak to you regarding the issue of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or making India a self-reliant economy. And it is the students who will be the ones who will make India a self-reliant economy as we go forward. I hope during this evening to talk to you about three broad periods of Indian history. I hope to briefly touch upon the Indian economy before the British came, secondly, India under the British, and thirdly, after independence. I've chosen these periods because they talk about how the issue of self-reliance came and how it can be taken forward. So if we may start, India before the British. Now in Thrissur itself, you have a fabled place in the economy of the country. It is well known that Vasco da Gama in 1498 came to Calicut and landed there. And it is no accident that Vasco da Gama came to Calicut, because Kerala was the gateway of India in terms of trade. The Malabar coast benefits from the monsoon winds, which blow straight from Kerala to Arabia and then reverse, making the trade links between the Malabar coast and old Mesopotamia and Egypt very important. In fact, I would like to share with you, if you go back in history, Ramesses II of Egypt was one of the greatest pharaohs Egypt has ever known. He is responsible for many of the buildings. He's called Ramesses the Great as a result. His tomb is in the fabled Valley of Kings. Now, when the archaeologists dug up his tomb in the Valley of Kings, of course, the body was mummified, which means the internal organs had been removed and a preservative chemical solution was applied to the body. They found in his nostrils, in the nasal cavity, they found small, round, black objects. These objects, ladies and gentlemen, were peppercorns, the black gold for which Kerala is famous. So if you look and see, 3,500 years ago, 70 generations ago, your ancestors were sending peppercorns as far away up the Red Sea as Egypt to be used for mummifying the Egyptian pharaohs. So at that point of time, clearly India was self-reliant, Kerala was self-reliant, Thrissur was self-reliant. In fact, the reference was made to Kodungalur a little earlier. Kodungalur at that time was known as Rome of the East. So you can imagine that India was not just self-reliant, much of the world was reliant on India. And that is from where we have moved forward. Now, I spoke to you about Kerala and Thrissur. What about India? Now, there have been different ideas of India as we go forward. I've picked out four. These are arbitrarily picked out. I could have picked out others. I could have talked about the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Cheras, and so on, but the Marathas, but time is limited. If you look at the top left-hand side, this was the Mauryan Empire, which then gave way to Ashoka the Great and others. This was in the 250 before the Common Era. And you can see from the map on the left-hand side that the Maurya Empire covered much of modern-day India with a good deal of what is current-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. So it was significantly India, but not exactly India. It was followed on the top right-hand side by the Delhi Sultanate. We study a lot about the Delhi Sultanate, but actually it was a very small part of India. As you can see, it basically covered the Gangetic Plains and not very much more after that. The Vijayanagar Empire in green on the lower right, this was the heart of southern India. together with the Bahmani kingdom of the Adil Shahis in Hyderabad. This covered the entire southern part of India and did not have much of the north. On the left-hand side, the Mughal Empire, which perhaps is the most recent, barring the Maratha Empire, and covered most of what is modern-day India, with a good deal of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran also wrapped in. Why am I mentioning this? I'm trying to make a point here. Whether it was the Mauryas or the Delhi Sultanates or the Vijayanagara Bahmani kingdom or the Mughals, they were Indian. They may have come as invaders from overseas. Babur of the Mughal kingdom, for example, was an invader from Uzbekistan. But the dynasty he founded was Indian. If you look at the Mughals, for example, they are the most recent. Babur was born in Samarkand. His tomb is in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. His body is back there. But the rest of his dynasty, Humayun, his son, was born on the tomb. His tomb is in Delhi. Humayun's son was Akbar the Great. Akbar's tomb is in Sikandra in Agra. Jahangir, his son, is buried in Lahore, which is current-day Pakistan, but was India at that point of time. Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, of course, everybody knows, are buried in Agra. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughals, is buried in Aurangabad. It is only the last of the Mughal Empire, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who is buried in Yangon, and that is because the British exiled him there, not because he wanted to go there. So what I'm trying to say is that all these invaders and rulers, they came to India. They were, for the better part, born in India. They lived in India. They got married in India. They had families in India. They made their wealth in India. They died in India. They were buried in India. And their wealth stayed in India. So if you look at the growth of India over the years, if you see, it's difficult to get data before the year zero, of course. I've started it from the Common Era. So if you forget the Indus Valley and the Maurya civilization, for which it is difficult to get data, but if you start from year number 1, I'll draw your attention to the green bar, the light green bar. Ladies and gentlemen, in the year 1 of the Common Era, India accounted for 32% of world GDP. 32%, almost 1/3. 1 out of every 3 rupees, or in those days there were no dollars, but there were rupiah. 1 out of every 3 was earned in India. That was the role of India when we began the millennium. If you see below it, there is China, which is the light brown bar. China was 25% in that year. So in the year 1, India at 32%, China at 25% accounted for more than 50% of world GDP. So we are talking of self-reliant. Ladies and gentlemen, the world was reliant on India and China, and more of India. Now, if you can see as the time goes by, you come on to this Delhi Sultanate, to the Vijayanagar kingdom, to the Mughal Empire, to the Maratha Empire, the green line remains steady. It moves up and down a little bit. China comes up into play, but basically it remains. India and China together continue to be well over 50% of the world economy. What happened after that? What made the difference? And here, if you look below, when we see the bar chart on the right-hand side, if you look now for Britain, the UK, you'll see a small green bar starting around in the year 1000. Before that, you don't even notice it. And it's still a small bar till around 1700. And then you see an inverse relationship. The green Indian bar starts to shrink and the green UK bar starts to expand. What happened, ladies and gentlemen, was the greatest transfer of wealth from a colony to a colonizer that the world has ever seen. The wealth of India was taken from India by the British. Unlike the Mughals, the Marathas, the Vijayanagar kingdom, the Bahmanis, they came to India, but the wealth didn't stay in India. The wealth was taken back to Britain. So as you can see, the reduction in Indian GDP and the increase in UK GDP. Now it follows. The same thing happened to China. The same thing happened to all the colonies. The colonies became poor. The colonizers became rich. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened. This chart shows you even more clearly. If you see on the right-hand side, GDP, you see how India and China decrease and are slowly starting to rise now. China, of course, more than India, whereas Europe, USA, and others have. Take a look at the chart on the right-hand side, the GDP per capita. You can see we all started almost from a common base in 1700, but thereafter what happened was we remained stagnant because the income went from India overseas. 1600, ladies and gentlemen, 31st of December 1600 was the founding of the East India Company. The East India Company, one of the most rapacious corporations ever established in the world. This was the reason for India to shrink and Britain to grow. Remember, this is the company which was also exporting opium to China and getting tea and silver. So the British started their days as being one of the largest drug smugglers of all time. Now that would have been funny, except that it was at the expense of India and other developing economies. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk of self-reliant India, it's important to remember that there was a time when we were not just self-reliant, but the rest of the world was reliant on us. What changed afterwards is as the British went. The charts I'm now showing you give you an idea of how the situation has changed. Now, of course, the British definitely, and I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, the next time you happen to visit London after the COVID is over, perhaps, and you land at the airport and you go to London and you see Trafalgar Square and you see the palaces and the castles and Windsor Castle and the Tower Bridge and all the rest of it, please remind yourself that all that was built on the back of wealth transferred out of India. It was not British wealth. It is Indian money which has built Britain. We have built Britain, unfortunately. Remember also that in the Second World War, the First World War, it is soldiers from India who were taken to fight these wars, a war which India had nothing to do with. We contributed soldiers, we contributed lives, we contributed money and grain. Remember, in the Second World War, Hitler is widely criticized for the extermination of 6 million Jews, and that was a terrible thing to happen. What most people don't remember is that in India, in the Bengal famine, 3 million people died of starvation, dysentery, and diarrhea. Why? Because Winston Churchill would take all the grain from India for keeping the Europeans alive. So when we criticize Hitler for being a war criminal, and yes, he was a war criminal, he was a mass murderer, let us apply that to Winston Churchill as well. He personally is responsible for 3 million Indian deaths. But we can't always blame the British. Yes, they were terrible. They did a lot of terrible things. But what happened afterwards? We can't keep blaming the past. We have to look to the future. If you see the charts, India's GDP was very, very flat and steady for many years. Now, there's a reason for this. When the British left, we were bereft of capital. In the 1960s and 1970s, the banking system hardly existed. Yes, of course, Dr. Xavier mentioned the number of banks in the Thrissur area. I personally come from Mangalore, the Udupi and Manipal area, where we had the birth of the Canara Bank, the Corporation Bank, the Syndicate Bank, the Vijaya Bank, but these were small regional banks. You didn't have a mechanism to collate savings and invest them. You did not have large stocks of capital. So under Pandit Nehru, we went in for the public sector. Now, these days, of course, it's become fashionable to criticize Nehru, but at that time, he never had a choice. The private sector simply never had the capital. It was later on in the 70s and 80s that the private sector had the capital. The real change in India came in 1990-91, when Dr. Manmohan Singh under P.V. Narasimha Rao introduced the reforms of 1990. And if you see the per capita income chart on the right-hand side, you'll see it is soon after 1991 that the slope of the line changes. Similarly, if you see the merchandise trade at the bottom, it is just after the early 90s that there's a dramatic change. Before that, our exports are almost flat. Then suddenly there is a growth. Exports start to boom, and India really starts to understand what is the meaning of self-reliant India or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, at this time, let's take a pause and ask ourselves, what do we mean by self-reliance? What is Atmanirbhar? It's a phrase which is often bandied about. What does Atmanirbhar mean? And I think the Prime Minister has clarified it on some occasions. Atmanirbhar does not mean autarky. It doesn't mean we go back to the bad old days of only looking inward and not looking outward. It doesn't mean we stop all imports and we only try to export. It's not possible, as I will demonstrate in the charts as we go by. Let's also accept that it is not that exports are good and imports are bad. There is nothing good or bad about exports or imports. It's commerce. We need to export enough to earn foreign exchange to pay for our imports. As simple as that. We don't need a huge trade surplus, but we don't need a huge trade deficit. We want to be reasonably in balance. It need not be exactly 50-50. It can be 40-60. It can be 60-40. It should be in that area. And that is what we mean, therefore, by self-reliance and by Atmanirbhar. Now comes the challenge. If you look at this chart on the left-hand side, this is manufacturing in India as a share of gross value added, which is GDP by another name. Now, this is a very unhappy chart. If you see, we were at about 18.35% in 2010. It has come down to 15% in 2019-20. Now, these numbers are very, very low. The average for Asia is around 30%, 30. Bangladesh, Vietnam are ahead of us. Let's not even talk about China. So something has gone wrong in our manufacturing sector. And because the manufacturing sector is trending down, you see the chart on the right-hand side of merchandise imports, which is trending up. What our manufacturing sector is unable to manufacture, we are importing. And much of these are intermediate goods, which increases the challenge. If you see the bar chart on this particular slide, take a look at some of the sectors. Let me select one for you. Let me take computer, electronics, and optical goods. You can see that in our exports of computer, electronic, and optical products, 36.8% is the import content. Now, this is the challenge. The more we import, naturally, the less is the value added in India. Added to it, if we are going to keep increasing tariffs on imports, what are we doing? We are making our own exports less competitive because the value of that is imported components. The same thing applies if you look at electrical equipment, if you look at machinery, and so on. So it doesn't mean that we stop imports, but we need to increase the exports vis-a-vis the share of imports. The bigger worry we have is not just imports. Just imports are by themselves not a problem, but we find to our great worry that a major source of our imports is China. And as you know, China is inimical. We are having border problems with China. We are having economic problems with China. In fact, I think the whole world has problems with China. We are not creating these problems. We are not coveting any territory outside. We are not trying to be expansionist, but China seems to have a problem with every country on its border. And unfortunately, we share a border with China. Now, China accounts for a major share of our imports. Now, if you see on the right-hand side, that gives you scary numbers: 40%, 39%, 34%, 31% for appliances, and so on. Now, it is not a good thing for us to be so dependent on China, because in the event of things going wrong, then what is going to be the recourse? You can't change your suppliers overnight. You can't change your manufacturing processes overnight. So A, we have to reduce our imports by producing more ourselves. B, we have to particularly make sure we are not overly dependent on China for these particular imports. This is where the difference would come in, and this is what we need to do to make sure we are self-reliant. Which are some of the sectors? Because it's easy. So far, I've been talking in broad terms. There are two broad kinds of sectors. One is sectors like, for example, plastics, chemicals, solar cells, rare earths. These are sectors where we already have a large trade deficit and import dependence, so we need to reduce that. We probably can't eliminate it, doesn't matter, but we want to reduce that deficit. The second is sectors like steel and auto components, where we actually have a trade surplus. But at the same time, in certain subcomponents, there is a deficit and we need to reduce that deficit. Now, I'll draw your attention to the blue bar at the bottom, because this is very important. If you look at these sectors which I've identified, these account for $186 billion of our imports. What does that number mean? That is 39% of our total imports, 50% of our non-oil imports, 57% of total manufactured imports. Which means if we can address these sectors and bring them into balance, then our trade deficit reduces by 50% overnight. So this is what it means to be self-reliant. These are the sectors we need to focus on. Let's go a little deeper into some of these sectors, because it's easy to say build up the sector, but what is our strategy for this sector? Let's start with capital goods. If you take a look at the chart on the top left-hand side, you can see that we are running a consistent trade deficit when it comes to capital goods. For capital goods, as all of you gentlemen who are in industry will agree, capital goods are the heart of industry. Capital goods are what create machinery which enable other productive EXIMs to happen. And this is where we need to look at compressors, plates, ball bearings, rubber molds, parts of molds, parts of air conditioners, and so on. These are areas which we can easily manufacture. We have the skills, but we need to have good certification. We need to increase preference to public procurement. We need to encourage investments in high-tech manufacturing zones so that we can eliminate this dependence when it comes to capital goods and move on to other areas. Similarly, in electronics. Now, electronics, ladies and gentlemen, is a big worry for the future. Take a look at the chart on the top left-hand side, and you can already see that we are running a massive trade deficit on electronics. Now, today, if you look at the numbers, if you disaggregate the components of India's exports and imports, the biggest deficit, the biggest sectoral deficit we have is in terms of petroleum. We import crude petroleum, we export refined petroleum. Ladies and gentlemen, within the next 5 years, the deficit on petroleum will be dwarfed by the deficit on electronics at the way things are going. So if we are going to be self-reliant, we have to develop our capacity in electronics, processors and controllers, telephones and mobiles, photosensitive semiconductors, integrated circuits, televisions, digital cameras, other consumer durables. Just look at the size of the orange bar vis-a-vis the blue bar, and you realize how much we need to increase. Now, the secret here is we have to be part of global value chains. We cannot survive manufacturing or exporting in isolation. We have to develop skills, which is why I was so happy to hear about the educational institutions in Thrissur. We have to leverage those skills and be an integral part of global value chains so that we can address this deficit when it comes to electronics. Similarly, plastics. Plastics, now this is an area which we are strong in, but we need to build up our strength even more, because if you see the share of plastics in our imports is steadily building up. And again, our largest single source of plastics with 19% of our total imports, the pink chart on the pink segment in the chart in the lower right is China. And as I said, we cannot afford to be overly dependent on China for our imports. So if we look at the components here in plastics, what are the areas we can look on? In PVC, for example, we have PVC manufacturers. The Sanmar group is well reputed. The Finolex Chabria group is reputed, but yet we have a trade deficit in PVC. Major importers are Japan and Taipei. We need to develop our skills in thermoplastics so that we can have a greater area in PVC. Polyethers as well. We are importing from China and Singapore, and these are used in all industries. It's an essential raw material for rubber processing, for pipe insulations, brake fluids. You name a part of a car and you need polyethers. In total trade in articles of plastics, which are dependent on China, take a look at that. Our trade deficit is huge in these areas. We need to build up our levels very significantly so that we can reduce the trade deficit on these areas and be self-sufficient here. So for this, we need to enter into comprehensive economic partnership agreements. We must not be afraid of groupings like the RCEP. Remember, in any trade grouping, it is always better to be on the inside looking out than on the outside looking in. If we are part of the grouping, we can influence its deliberations, we can influence its decisions. But if we stay clear of these groupings, then we cannot. We will be the outsider, and after some time, they will not wait for us much longer. So we need to look at being part of these kind of global agreements. If we move on to pulses and edible oils, we are perhaps one of the biggest importers of pulses and edible oils. We have a large vegetarian population, and even the non-vegetarian population enjoys lentils. All of us, for us, dal rice or dal roti is our comfort food. And because of our skewed agricultural system, where the MSP is skewed towards food grains, we pay a high MSP for rice, for wheat, for sugarcane, but not as much for pulses. Therefore, we are left to import pulses. We are left to import vegetable oils and edible oils for our cooking. Now, this is in many ways a travesty. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all from Kerala. All of us, and I'm from Karnataka, we are all rice eaters. Yet, which is the states in India which are growing the maximum rice? It is Punjab and Haryana. Now, this does not make sense. The Punjabi or the Haryanvi does not eat rice, they eat wheat. At best, they eat rajma chawal. Why is rice being grown in the Punjab and Haryana when they are water scarce? The water table is dropping. because of the distortions caused by the MSP. We need to stop these distorted MSPs and ensure that rice is grown where rice is consumed, wheat is grown where wheat is consumed, and therefore we save water. Remember, we are a water scarce country. If we are going to subsidize the growth of sugarcane and then subsidize the export of that sugar, ladies and gentlemen, we are exporting water, and we cannot afford to export water. So our entire agricultural sector needs a relook when it comes to pulses, when it comes to edible oils. If you see the deficit we have in pulses and edible oils, you can see that the drop is very significant. We are huge net importers, and this will make a huge difference. Our trade deficit on crude palm oil alone is 3.5 billion. That's almost 1%, almost 2% of our trade deficit. On soybean oil, it is 2.2 billion, and so on. So we need to make investments in agriculture in areas, countries like Mozambique, where land is available in plenty. If you visit Mozambique, and there are a large number of Keralites in Mozambique, they will tell you that you simply drop a mango in the soil and a mango tree will sprout. It is that fertile. You put your hand in the river and a fish will come into your hand. They are sparsely populated. They will welcome agricultural initiatives from here, which could then come and meet India's needs for edible oils and for pulses. Rare earths. This is a product of the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the mobile phones that all of us use, the computers, the iPads, all the electronics we use depend critically on rare earths. Now, rare earths is a misnomer. They're not rare. They are all over the world, but the concentration in the Earth's crust is very low. So extraction of the rare earth elements is very expensive and very polluting. China, unfortunately, specialized. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you a shock. If you take a look at the chart on the top left-hand side, take a look at the yellow. Can you see any color other than yellow? It's very difficult. There's a little bit of blue there, which is the USA. There's a little bit of pink and orange, which is Australia. There's a little bit of green, which is Russia. And you can hardly see India, but you can see China. China is the world's monopolist when it comes to rare earth elements. Some time ago, when China had a dispute with Japan, what did they do? They didn't send the army. They didn't send the navy. They simply said that our rare earth manufacturing is being relooked at. There are certain norms being changed, and suddenly there was no rare earths being exported to Japan or to Korea. And those industries almost collapsed, because without rare earths, without cobalt, without selenium, without lithium, you cannot manufacture electronics. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the danger. We talk about Ladakh, we talk about the Galwan Valley, we talk about Depsang, and yes, these are very important. But even more important is the economic angle. This is something we don't give enough importance to, and we have to build up our capability on rare earths together with Australia and the US, which form the Quad. This is our trade in the rare earth sector. I've shown you the details. I don't intend to go to all the numbers because there isn't time for that. But if you can see our trade deficit, and best of all, if you look at the numbers in 2017 and 2018, you'll realize that we have turned the corner. Now, this is a live example of Atmanirbharta, or self-reliance. We have realized the danger. We have started building up capacity, and now our trade deficit has become a surplus. It's a small surplus, but it shows what we can do when we want to make up our minds and address the problem. Not only rare earths, let's take a look at the solar sector. As you know, our Honorable Prime Minister is trying to boost the renewable power sector in India, specifically solar and also wind power. And in India, we have a land blessed with sunlight through much of the year. We have areas which can use large sunlight, where the incidence of sunlight gives you an ample source of power. So we are well positioned in every way into building up our solar power capacity. Now, where are we lacking, however, on this particular area? What does solar need? Solar needs a large area. It needs ground area. It needs coverage. Remember, solar cannot give you base load power. So base load power has to come from thermal, to some extent hydro, because you don't know when the sun is going to go behind a cloud, or there is going to be pollution in the air. So your solar sector cannot match that. But solar can reduce the pollution. You're already aware, we read every year in the papers of how in New Delhi, you have the stubble burning and the pollution, which makes the air quality in Delhi almost unbearable. Bombay is heading that way, but we have the benefit of the sea breeze, and I'm sure in Thrissur you have that benefit as well. But if we can convert a significant part of our industry of power into renewables, our pollution problem is taken care of, our health problem is taken care of very significantly. Why do I mention this so much in the context of solar? Because if you look at solar PV, we are importing almost everything. We have been a net importer of photovoltaic cells since 2011. And who are we importing this from? Again, I'm sorry, if you look at the pie chart in the lower left-hand side, the biggest source of our imports is China. So what we are doing essentially is we are enriching China. Until we can create that capacity, the chip capacity, the photovoltaic chips, the blocks, the carving of the chips, the making of the modules, until that happens, all we are doing is putting money in China's pocket. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of what self-reliance means. We are all Indians. We are proud Indians. We want India to grow. We want our country to grow and develop. We are not interested in making China rich. So this is another area in solar PV cells, which we need to immediately address this area. Now, what does it mean going forward? So far, I've talked to you about various areas of sectors. I've talked to you about various areas where we are in deficit with China. This means building up our manufacturing sector. It means long-term finance from development financial institutions has to be available to industries so that they have the long-term patient capital. If you go back to the days of the development financial institutions, IFCI, IDBI, ICICI, we talk about the Tatas, the Birlas. Dr. Xavier mentioned the large number of industrialists in Thrissur itself. We talk of Reliance, Dhirubhai Ambani himself. Let us remember that all of them got long-term patient capital from the development financial institutions. Had it not been for IDBI, ICICI, IFCI, our industry would not exist. The difference between India today and the African continent is that we have a good banking system. We have long-term patient capital, which allows industry to grow. Africa does not, and that you can see the difference. The entire Indian subcontinent, with a land area 1/10 of Africa, with a population the same as Africa, has a GDP the same as Africa because of our financial and banking system. So we need development financial institutions which will provide this kind of patient capital. Dr. Xavier mentioned Manappuram Finance, and Manappuram Finance is an excellent finance company. But with due respect to Manappuram, it cannot do industrial financing. It can address the consumer needs, it can address gold loans, but it cannot address a petrochemical plant, it cannot address a cement plant, it cannot address a photovoltaics plant. So we need to create this capacity. We need special economic zones, we need incentives to manufacturers, we need the government to procure land and make it available to industry on terms that will be adequate and competitive so that they can compete with their people overseas. And we need an understanding tax system. We do not need the income tax people checking every single invoice. There must be greater trust between the government on the one hand and industry on the other hand, so that we work as partners. We are not antagonists. We are not fighting against each other, but the bankers, the industrialists, the labor, and the government must work together as partners. That is what happens in Japan. That is what happens in South Korea. That is what must happen in India, so that we can truly be self-reliant and take our country to greater heights. Remember the opening slide I showed you? If I may go back to that briefly, when we showed the share of Indian GDP. I don't expect that we will go back to 32% of GDP that we were at that point of time. Not possible. But certainly, we should be a significant player. We are already the 5th largest in nominal GDP. We are 3rd largest in PPP terms. We need to come back to the days of our glory. We cannot keep blaming the British. Yes, they were terrible people, but we are a new generation. We have young people who are willing to grow. We have people who are willing to take up their rightful share in the world. And that is what will make India Atmanirbhar. An attitude that questions, and a student who learns more, an entrepreneurial class which wants to invest and grow rich, and a infrastructure system of government, finance, regulation, which all contributes to growing. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what will take us to Atmanirbhar Bharat. In this context, EXIM Bank is there, partnership for growth, globalizing India, And we look forward to working with you and your members in making India self-reliant, in making our country back to the days when not just were we self-reliant, but much of the world was reliant on us. Let me take a break at this point of time. I think I've spoken a little faster, so I've finished about 2 minutes early, but I would be very happy to take any questions that any of you may have. And especially if you have any students in the audience, it would be my absolute delight to answer any questions from them. Thank you very much for patiently hearing me out. I am sorry it has been a one-way transaction all this time, but I hope it can be two-way from now going forward. Thank you very much.
David sir, it was a very wonderful program, wonderful talk, and our decision to invite you as a chief guest, we think that it was right. And only an economist can perform like this. Usually, when we invite speakers, they'll be speaking without touching the economic aspect. Now, we are very happy that you are an economist. You are really worth for the gold medalist that you got. Thanks a lot. Now it is time for the people, the participant to ask questions, especially the students. Please.
Sir, before the interaction, we have a pleasant task which you should request Mr. David Rasquinha to inaugurate the year-long activities of TMA.
Yeah.
So let us have a virtual inauguration that we would love to have our chief guest to do that.
David sir, you have to declare that the activities of TMA 2021 is inaugurated, please.
It is my great pleasure. It is my honor to, in fact, declare that the activities for 2021 of the TMA are inaugurated, and I wish you all the very, very best in all the program as you go forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Okay, the questions, please.
It's time for interaction. Kindly, only those who wishes to ask questions, kindly unmute and then ask the questions, then mute. Or you can put in chat. We would be able to see that also.
Yes, there is a question from Anjana, the student of Indian Institute of Management Studies.
Yeah, shall I answer the question, please?
Her question is that, in your view,
Yes.
you have seen the question, sir?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, you please answer it.
Okay, I'll go in serial order. The first question is from Ms. Anjali, a student of the Elijah Institute of Management, on what reforms need rapid progress for self-reliant. I think it's what I ended up just now saying. We need to change this mindset of antagonism, a mindset where the government does not trust industry, industry is suspicious of government. There are changes in regulations on a retrospective basis. There are tax demands which are made, which are unreasonable. That atmosphere needs to change. If the atmosphere is positive, everything else can be happened. So if you ask me the one single reform that is most important, I would change the mindset and the atmosphere. Finance, land, all that can follow. It is the mindset which needs changing. There's also a question from Ms. Anjana, a student of the same Elijah Institute. Will there be any negative impact of being self-reliant? No, madam. As I said, self-reliant does not mean inward looking. It means outward looking. It only means that we reduce our dependence on the world and make it more or less in balance. I am not in any way, and I think the Prime Minister's concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat also does not mean that we stop dealing with the world. No, we increase our dealing with the world, but we deal with the world as an equal. We deal from a position of strength rather than right now when it is a position of weakness. Mr. Paulson, also from the same institute, should globalization go hand in hand with self-reliance? Yes, absolutely. You cannot have, the days when people could be an autarkic economy being self-reliant and ignoring the world, there's only one country which does that, and that is North Korea. And we do not want to be North Korea. And I can assure you that North Korea also does business with the rest of the world, but it does it very quietly because it is afraid of sanctions. So globalization is very much part of self-reliance. When we are talking of being self-reliant, we are also talking of globalization. We are talking of dealing with the overseas world on a one-to-one basis. There's a question from Ms. Blessy Babu. What can we tell when a country is fully self-reliant? Good question. I would say the measure comes in your balance of trade or your current account. As I said, there is nothing good about exports and bad about imports. No, it's commerce. Exports are buying, imports are buying, exports are selling, imports are selling. It is just as if you go to a supermarket. You would tell that the country is self-reliant when your exports are enough to pay for your imports. See, after all, we have to import some things. We are not blessed with petroleum resources. We have to import some of them. We have huge reserves of bauxite, but we do not have reserves of coking coal. So we have to import some things. We need to export enough so that we can pay for the imports. And that is what will say that, yes, we are self-reliant. We do not need to then borrow from the rest of the world in order to pay for our imports, but the world buys enough of goods and services from India, giving us the foreign exchange that we need to pay for our imports. Ms. Meera Rajivan, on large corporates or through SME sector, madam, the two are interrelated. I assure you that the large corporate cannot function without the MSME. A large corporate buys a lot of goods from the SME sector, sub-assemblies, components, services, ongoing issues. Neither the large corporate can manage without the MSME, nor the SME can manage without it. In fact, we need better integration of the two so that the large corporate pays more orders, pays for those orders on time, and the MSME can also grow. So it is a synergistic relationship. Mr. Deepak Matthew from the Elijah Institute, when will India become an importing power rather than importing dependent? I'm not sure I understand the question. I don't think we want to become an importing power or import dependent. Maybe you meant an exporting power, but I don't think we need to be looking at an exporting power either. Because ultimately, if you look, it is one world. The overall world, the trade has to be in balance. Since we are all part of a closed system, no one country can be hugely in surplus for a long period of time because some other country has to be in deficit. So we should be looking at a reasonable balance. I don't think we should be looking at being a huge exporting power. From Ms. Swati Krishna, what is the best way to achieve self-reliance? As I mentioned, we have to boost the manufacturing sector. We need to provide long-term patient finance to enable them to build up their market position. We need to provide land at economic rates on long lease or purchase by the government so that the industries can be set up. And my first point, which I still think is the most important, we need to change the mindset in the country so that government, industry, labor, capital are partners rather than being adversaries, which right now, unfortunately, we are in some ways adversarial. Mr. Anand Menon, the take on the agriculture reforms and the strong objection from farmers. Okay, I'm going to be a little controversial here. I think these are very good reforms. Bear in mind that the objection from Punjab and the farmers in Punjab and Haryana is a localized objection. The farmers are worried that in case the Mandi system is done away with, the APMC system is done away with, who will purchase their products of food grains at the MSP? Now, you're aware the government has already made a public statement that the MSP remains and all the grain will be taken up. So to some extent, it is an information issue. The state governments are earning large sums by way of commissions at the APMC and are reluctant to give them up. So there is a vested interest in any system. When you try to bring in change, the vested interest always wants to. But if you look at it from the viewpoint of the farmer, why should the farmer be compelled to sell his goods only in a local area? You're all businessmen, ladies and gentlemen, or you're students of finance and business. You know that the bigger your market, the greater your number of buyers, the better the ability you have of getting a better price. So I think these are good reform measures. It will take time to sink in. It will take time for us to understand the impact, but I am very much in favor of these reforms which have been announced, including corporate farming, which has been pushed forward. From Mr. Reynolds, where do we stand in exports in the last 2 quarters in the pandemic, increase or decrease? Mr. Reynolds, don't worry about this year. Let us look through these numbers. See, this is a force majeure year, and not just for India, for every country. China, perhaps because it is recovered, the statistics in China show they are growing. I'm not entirely sure of the statistics, but the statistics in China show they are growing. But the rest of the world is all degrowing. Now, this is a once in a lifetime event, the kind of black swan event that Dr. Nassim Taleb had mentioned in his book. So forget this year. This year is a gone year. Do not look at this. We will recover from this. If you see all the GDP estimates, we are going to have this as a lost year because depending whose estimate you take, we are going to reduce by 8% or reduce by 28%. The real number is somewhere in between. We will not know. What is more important is next year we will grow by that same event. If we lose 8% this year, we will grow 10% next year. If we lose 13% this year, we will grow 15% next year. So look at this as a temporary thing. When we look at the broad thrust of history, 2 quarters are nothing. So allow for this as an extraordinary event. Forget the numbers, forget the exports of these 2 quarters. Look forward to what is going to happen.
Do you think that we will take off?
Definitely, sir. Definitely. If you look at it, sir, even if you look at up to March, our GDP was growing at about 4.2%. Exports were still positive. And you know, something which we always forget in India. If you look at the export chart, it seems to be flat. But that is because we are looking at an export chart in dollars. And the rupee has been depreciating against the dollars by on a rough about 8 to 10% per annum. So if you see a flat dollar with the 8 to 10% depreciation, your actual exports in quantity or rupee terms have been growing at 8 to 10%. It is just a statistical mirage that because you're converting to dollars on a depreciated rupee, it looks as if exports are stuck. So if we accept that exports were growing, that GDP was growing at a smaller rate undoubtedly, why has the degrowth happened? Because of COVID. So when COVID is addressed, naturally that growth should resume. There is no other factor other than COVID which is holding it down. So I am very confident that by March, April, we will have a vaccine. It will take time. Because we have a vaccine doesn't mean the problem is over. It will take 3-4 months for the population to achieve a level of vaccination, which will give us herd immunity. But just as I know that this year is going to be a lost year, I'm absolutely sure that the year ended March 21, the next year is going to be a terrific year.
Do you think the country will be able to take off? I mean, increase the productivity to the normal level, because it is terribly damaged. And you have to regain and re-gear the productivity to the level it was, which may be very difficult for the companies to do. Don't you think that?
Very true, sir. I agree with you. It is not going to be an easy job, but I am still optimistic because we have some of the best entrepreneurs and best industrialists in the world. How did our software industry grow from nothing? How did so many of our industries grow from nothing to where they are today? They faced difficulties. This is not the first time India has faced difficulties. We were almost bankrupt in 1991-92. We still managed to come by. We had the global crisis in 2007, 2008. We could not borrow money internationally. Our exports plunged, the government budget deficit. We managed there. I have every confidence in the Indian economy and the Indian entrepreneur. Yes, it is a challenge. Everything is going to be a challenge, but we have the ability to come back. Remember, our base production capacity is not halted. Our labor went back to their home plates because there was no room for them. Logistics were interrupted, but our factories remain, our machinery remains intact, our knowledge remains intact, our know-how remains intact, our overseas contacts remain intact. It is a matter of starting them again. I'm very sure we will be able to do it.
But the network is damaged. Network is scattered.
Absolutely.
It's lost.
Sir,
Undoubtedly, sir, but not only India. The whole world is facing that. And the whole world has to deal with this problem. I'm sure we'll be able to address it.
Sir, I am Engineer Gopalakrishnan.
Please, sir.
Thrissur is also famous for the Thrissur Puram, you know that. One of the important part of the Thrissur Puram is the firework. And it's got a audible version as well as a colorful version. And I am very thankful to you because we started the inaugural program with a colorful fireworks. Thank you for that. Okay, my question is this: you mentioned in your speech that India and China were the leading economy in the pre-colonial period, and India was the number one out of that. And you see the situation now. Now China is very much far ahead of us in the economy. Do you think it is because of the path we followed, the democratic path as well as what the so-called communist or socialist path they followed? Any correlation with this, sir?
Yes and no, sir. Definitely the authoritarian system in China helped because they could take very difficult decisions without bothering about being re-elected or winning an election. So to that extent, it is there. But I would say the difference between India and China is not so much from the political systems as from the economic ideology. We consider China as communist. Believe me, they are more capitalist than communist.
You're right.
Even though they are,
Yeah, you have been so many times there.
absolutely. Though there is a communist party, it is as good as a capitalist party. Mr. Xi Jinping, who is the prime minister, is like an oligopolist. He's like an industrialist. So the ideology of communism doesn't exist. If you remember, the ideology of communism is based on Karl Marx, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, all preference to the worker. Do you hear anything about Chinese workers? You only hear about their industrialists, right? So China is anything but communist. It has gone to a capitalist economy. It maintains the trappings and the labels of communism to fool the people, but it is entirely a capitalist economy, and that is why it has grown. In India, unfortunately, we have not graduated beyond socialism. We still talk of socialism. We still want the government to do everything. We still have a bureaucracy which tries to do too many things at the same time. For example, you have a bureaucracy which is looking at anti-profiteering after GST. GST was introduced in 2017. We are now in 2020. Why is that authority still there? I don't know, but it is there. You have a Ministry of Culture, which is running museums. Why do you need a government to run museums? I don't know. You have a whole department in the Ministry of Finance which is looking at disinvestment, and there is hardly any disinvestment which is happening. So we need to have more faith in our private sector, in our industrial sector. That is where we are going wrong. I'll give you one example, or two examples if you like. In the 80s and 90s, there was an Indian industry centered around Hyderabad, which grew phenomenally by using reverse engineering of biochemistry and chemistry in order to create off-patent drugs. Today, the pharma industry is known all around the world. Did the government have anything to do with it? No. It was Dr. Anji Reddy of Reddy's Laboratories and others of his level who started all these industries. Today, the world is looking at India to manufacture a vaccine for COVID. Though they may invent it overseas, the manufacturer will be a Bharat Biotech, Bharat GmbH, a Serum Institute, and others of their ilk, right? So how did this industry grow? It was the Indian entrepreneur who said that there is an opportunity and I will make it. My second example is the software industry, which happened in the late 90s when nobody in government, and for that matter, in most of the banks, including my bank, we didn't even know what is software. We used to see these floppy diskettes. At least my generation goes back to the floppy diskettes. Some of you younger persons may not remember that. We used to see a floppy diskette and some strange thing. Did government have anything to do with that? No, it's an industry which came up on its own. So I would say that we have the ability, we have the entrepreneurial skills. We just need to be given patient capital by means of finance and an enabling system, and we can beat the world.
And
Right.
the reason is, in software, the trade union has not yet entered. And that is the only reason the software field is successful. In China, you look to China, the productivity is of utmost importance. But is that the case in India? We don't think a damn about the productivity, and we don't have the productivity. In software, there is productivity, and they give importance to the productivity. And that is the difference. If you give importance to the productivity, we can improve, which don't happen.
I fully agree with you. We have distorted our system of labor. In fact, the simple example I can give you is when you take a contract labor. Now, a contract labor is somebody who's supposed to be for a temporary period of time. So you pay him a premium because he's there for a short while and then he leaves without benefits. The system is now so perverted because you cannot fire a laborer unless you have more than only less than a certain number of workers. You are not allowed to sack them without the permission of the government, and that permission never comes. The result is industry doesn't want to hire labor. So they take people on a contract on a hire and fire basis, and nobody benefits. The industry does not benefit because there is no long-term investment in skill. The labor does not benefit because they are living from day to day. So the system has become distorted by this kind. I fully agree with you. Software could do it because there was no labor infringement over there. But in many cases, let me also point out to industries where labor has been treated well. The Tata Group, the Godrej Group is renowned in India for the care they take of their labor. Have you ever heard of a strike in Tata Steel or Tata or any of the Tata companies or any of the Godrej companies? So you also have enlightened promoters who make the job so attractive for the labor that the labor doesn't want to, because they are convinced that their interests are being taken care of. Now, perhaps we need to learn from that also. It has to be a combination of both.
Sir, we'll be having one more for the participants, please. One more question only. So
Good
we are
evening,
reaching
sir.
time.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, I'm Aishwarya Yuva, third semester MPA student at ELISA Institute of Management Studies. So my question is there any difference between self-reliance and self-sufficiency? Can you
Oh,
explain
yes.
about it?
Thank you, Ms. Aishwarya. That's an excellent question. Yes, there
Thank
is
you,
a
sir.
world of difference. Self-sufficiency means I don't look outside. I do everything myself. I sit at home, I cook my own food, I grow my own food, I make my salt by getting salt water, I collect rainwater and I drink the rainwater. I don't look outside my home or outside my country at all. Then I'm self-sufficient. Now, that is not what is meant by self-reliance. Self-reliance means we are a member of the global family, but we are not over-dependent. As I said, our measure has to be what is the level of our exports versus imports. It has to be reasonably in balance. Right now, our exports are barely around 60% of our imports, which is not a good number. We have to come to a point where it is nearer to 50-50, 50-45, 45-55, then we can say we are self-reliant. So being self-reliant is between 60-40 and 40-60. Being self-sufficient is 100-0. 100-0 is not possible and not recommended also. I hope I've answered your question.